When I was living in a third world country some years ago, there was this guy about my age. I was 19 at the time. He was blind, and sometimes wandered the streets of my neighborhood selling brooms, which he carried in a bundle on his back. He didn't have a dog or anything, just a staff. I saw him walk by the house where we lived a few times, and I felt kind of sorry for him, but the first few times didn't really think much of it. What struck me about him, I suppose, was that he was my age. Normally, poor people on the streets are very old or very young, or maybe women with children. Here was a dude that looked otherwise healthy yet was obviously quite destitute but tried to make a living despite his disability, and believe me, it's quite different to live with a disability in a country like that than it is in France or the US. A few months after I had last seen him, I came home, and my mom was having a reunion with some of her lady expat friends as she did once a week. Tea and so on. I stopped by the solarium where they were, said hello to all, and proceeded to grab me a soda and a few pastries. While I was doing this, I picked up on the conversation they were having. It turns out that the day before there had been a murder in a poor neighborhood that bordered ours. Not an unusual occurrence, but what stopped me was one of the ladies saying that they had killed a blind couple. I inquired further, and it turns out that it was this guy. The ladies knew him, of course, because they lived in the same area, and I suppose even bought a broom or two from him at some point. Then it got worse. He lived in a little house with his wife, who was also blind. Apparently, she worked doing needlepoint or something like that. Unknown number of men had broken into their house at night, assaulted the guy. I mean, how could he defend himself? And while he was lying on the floor bleeding, sexually assaulted his wife repeatedly. Then they stabbed her and kicked the guy's head against the concrete floor of the house as they were leaving, killing him. She was still alive when they found her the next morning, but she died later. These were two disabled kids who had rallied against poverty and discrimination and tried to make it in the world on their own. They didn't deserve it. I think this has stuck with me over the years as something very sad, because I always remembered seeing the guy walking slowly with his staff clicking on the pavement, yelling out brooms, brooms, and I wanted to come over and talk to him, ask him what his name was, if he had been born that way, and maybe help. Hell, maybe even buy a broom I didn't need. But I never did it. I could never shake the feeling that maybe I could have done something for him and his wife, if I had known she existed, that maybe I could have prevented that from happening to them. His name was Ernesto, and his wife's name was Zoila. I never saw or met Zoila, but I think I'll remember her and his husband until the day I die. When I was a small boy, I used to see poor street kids outside. They wore rags, were often hungry and dirty. They were paupers, illiterate and uneducated. I'm not sure whether they had parents. Most didn't. Some would have their limbs broken by unscrupulous people, so they could elicit more sympathy as they begged for money. A truly heart-wrenching sight. They would often sift through the rubbish for their food. It was very sad seeing this, even when I was a young boy, seeing that they weren't that different from me. But there was this one poor girl. Her parents must have died or something, for I would often see her going from house to house begging for food. Sometimes people would throw scraps of food out for the dogs, and I would often see her eating those scraps with them. Like the others, her clothing barely sufficed to hide her nakedness. It would do for the summer, but in the winter she would struggle. And so winter came. I recall me starting school, and me feeling sorry for her that she didn't go. It was an especially cold night, one where it snowed. The temperature must have been below zero for sure. I recall her knocking on the door, banging, pleading for someone to let her in. My mother answered the door and scolded her, telling her to go away. These street kids were treated worse than those slum dogs. The door was slammed. She was still outside, knocking, pleading for some respite from the bitter wind. But to no avail. The night passed as normal. I dressed to go to school the next day. Snowed all night. Everything was white outside, glistening in the sun. Outside, I saw a strange lump of snow, just near the doorstep. It was as if somebody left some rocks there overnight. I uncovered the snow, curious to see what underneath, when then all of a sudden I recoiled back in horror. It was the poor child, frozen solid in the snow. She died outside our very doorstep, in the cold. I was shocked, and my heart welled up with guilt and pity for her. Why didn't my poor old mother let her in? Why didn't I let her in? Surely if I asked my mother, she would have taken care of that poor orphan child. I hope she's gone off to a much better place, away from cruel and unsympathetic people like me. She has been etched in my memory ever since. A truly heartbreaking moment. The guilt never ever goes away. She was my age, perhaps 4 or 5. May her soul rest in peace.